Elizabeth was born around 1437 in Northamptonshire. She was the first child from her parents, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, who had many family links to royalty, and her father, Richard Woodville, a knight. The marriage caused quite a scandal at court. Her mother was through marriage an aunt to the king, Henry VI, and she had extremely high rank, so the marriage was well below her. The War of the Roses is a famous civil war that took place in England and lasted decades. Everyone in England lived in its shadow as the houses of York and Lancaster battled for the throne. So Elizabeth's family were supporters of Lancaster, but things weren't always set in stone, which is clear as she ended up very much in the side of York. Families didn't always have the luxury of being staunchly loyal to one house or another. As power shifted, people had to put themselves into the best position possible to secure their own future, and that's exactly what Elizabeth did. When Elizabeth was around 16, she married for the first time to John Grey. Fun fact, John is the great-great-grandfather of the famous 9-day queen Jane Grey. The couple had 2 sons, Thomas born in 1455 and Richard born in 1457. 4 years later, John died while fighting in a battle for Lancaster, leaving Elizabeth a widow and a single mother. One of the many problems with the War of the Roses were that people's fortunes could rise and fall depending on which side was doing well. This is why some tried to keep good with both sides. This affects Elizabeth, as when York came into power, her son's inheritance was in danger, and therefore legend tells us that she tracked down the king while he was in the area and told him of the situation. Elizabeth was described as being the most beautiful woman in England. Edward was described as being a big womanizer, so it's not surprising he wanted more than just a passing conversation with her. As a member of the royal family, let alone being the king, he would have been thinking to marry for strategic reasons and not for love, as so many royals had done before. But Edward in fact married Elizabeth in a secret ceremony with few witnesses. And the secret was kept for some time until Elizabeth was brought before the court and she was eventually crowned Queen of England about a year after the wedding. This was a triumph for Elizabeth. She had married the King of England, a position she could never have hoped for, and yet here she was. Unfortunately though, this was not an easy start, as many powerful people at court were not happy about their new queen. Courtiers believed in the importance of rank and the order of things. To have Elizabeth, whose family had supported Lancaster, and who was a commoner, and now more important than all these high-born ladies at court, was something they were not happy about. As well as that, Elizabeth had an enemy in Edward's brother, the Duke of Clarence, and the Earl of Warwick, who was so powerful at the time he was known as the Kingmaker. This must have been such an intense time for Elizabeth. She had risen so high, but many were hoping to bring her down. But Elizabeth did not waste this opportunity for power. She ensured her family made advantageous marriages, as well as giving them positions of power and privilege to secure their position. You can't really blame her for that, but it's not surprising that some resented it. But time passed and the couple seemed to have been quite happy together. Edward built a good relationship with Elizabeth's 2 sons, and they themselves started having children. Their first child was Princess Elizabeth, who would be known as Elizabeth of York and would one day become Queen of England. Trouble wasn't far away, and in time Warwick and Clarence rebelled against Edward, and Kingmaker Warwick had Lancastrian King Henry VI back on the throne. This was a disaster for Elizabeth. Edward fled, and while pregnant she went with her children into sanctuary. It was here that she gave birth to her first son from this marriage, Prince Edward, who was born in November 1470. England had a new heir, and despite her situation, Elizabeth would have been over the moon. Power shifted, and about 6 months after the birth of the prince, Edward was king once again, and Elizabeth went from sanctuary back into the royal palace and the role of queen, which she loved. Some fishy stuff went down for sure when Edward returned. Henry VI died somewhat mysteriously while he was imprisoned in the Tower, and many believe his death was ordered by Edward. If this is the case, it shines an interesting light on Edward. So many people had died in the wars already, so how much therefore should we condemn him for this one murder? By having Henry removed, he also lessened the possibility of people using him to get Lancaster back in power, meaning more wars. On the other hand, Henry was not a soldier, he was a weak man and just a pawn. So if it was murder, it seems really cruel. It also makes me wonder how much knowledge or even involvement would Elizabeth have in these plans. Elizabeth was smart and very ambitious, and as we will see in her actions in the future, there is almost nothing she wouldn't do to keep power, no matter what the consequence. Whether she knew about it or not, I suspect she wouldn't have had much problem with it. For more than a decade, Edward and Elizabeth stayed in the throne. There were still threats to them, but they managed to navigate their way through them and stay in power. Elizabeth continued having more children. In fact, she had 6 more, one of which was her son, Prince Richard, born in 1473. Now, if you think there'd been enough drama in one person's life, then there was a whole lot more to come for Elizabeth. King Edward died quite suddenly, aged 40, in 1483. This meant his son, Prince Edward, who was still only 12, was now King Edward V. But a child on the throne was far from ideal. He obviously couldn't rule alone, and it all kicked off. Probably due to the fact that he may have expected to live much longer, it doesn't seem Edward IV had put much in place as to what would happen after his death. I guess they all assumed Prince Edward would be old enough by that time to manage it himself. The former king did say that his younger brother Richard would become protector to his son. Not a huge amount seems to be known about Elizabeth's relationship with Richard, at least to this point, but Elizabeth wanted all the power to remain with her and her family, so she may well have been unhappy about this situation. Part of the problem was the arrangement with Richard being protector was so vague. For how long was he meant to be in this role? Expectations weren't clear, so a scramble for control followed as Richard knew he needed to take possession of the new king, who it seems didn't have much of a relationship with his uncle Richard. Instead, it seems he was much closer to his uncle from his mother's side, as well as his older half-brother. But these two were arrested and in time executed. Edward went with his uncle Richard to London and to the Tower. After how he treated her family, it's not surprising Elizabeth was highly anxious for her family's safety, so she went back into sanctuary with her children and had a nervous wait to see what would happen next. Elizabeth made a terrible mistake by allowing her younger son Richard to be taken out of sanctuary to join his brother in the Tower. Now neither of the heirs were in her control, which massively weakened her position. As well as this, Richard the Protector was convinced that Elizabeth wanted him dead. To be fair, she may well have wanted that. Richard's behaviour became more erratic as he surrounded himself with people who told him he was right, and removed and sometimes executed those who were against him. The children of Edward IV and Elizabeth were declared illegitimate by Parliament due to a pre-contract Edward had supposedly had before marriage with Elizabeth. Convenient that no one cared about this before, but now it was an issue while Richard had his eyes on the throne. Prince Edward should have been crowned in June 1483, but not too long after this planned date, it was in fact his uncle Richard who was crowned as King Richard III. The brothers remained in the Tower, but in time they would never be seen again. The mystery of their fate still fascinates history fans today. It's commonly believed that Richard ordered the boys' murder, But what really happened, I guess we will never know for sure. I cannot even imagine the mental strain Elizabeth must have been under while she waited in sanctuary. Friends and allies would have brought her information, but with rumours going mad, it must have been very hard to put it all together in her head. As she waited, her hatred for Richard grew and grew. In time, she must have realised that her sons were gone, and she started thinking about the future. It would not have been unreasonable for her to want to really step back at this point and live a more peaceful life, but as I said before, Elizabeth was crazy ambitious and power hungry. I do understand she wanted revenge on Richard and to raise her family high once again, but in some ways it's hard to relate to Elizabeth now forming a new plot to put her daughter Elizabeth on the throne. Think how many of her loved ones had died in the battles for power. Her husband, father, 2 of her brothers and 3 of her sons were dead, as well as countless others in battle, and still she wasn't done. Elizabeth now teamed up with Margaret Beaufort, the mother of exiled Henry Tudor, who had a claim to the throne, although a shaky one, through his mother and the Lancastrian side. The idea to marry him to Elizabeth's daughter would seriously strengthen his position if he were to become king, and would unite the houses. Henry wanted this too, and his mother was just as determined as Elizabeth to oust Richard. The 2 women worked to bring the plan to reality. On promise of good treatment, Elizabeth and her daughters left sanctuary and returned to court. Due to the ruling about the validity of her marriage, Elizabeth was no longer seen as a former queen. Some time passed with seemingly not much activity as everyone adjusted to the current situation, but Elizabeth's hatred for Richard remained. Although Elizabeth and Margaret Beaufort had this plan to make their children king and queen, nothing was guaranteed. But in August 1485, in the Battle of Bosworth Field, King Richard was in fact defeated by Henry Tudor, and he became King Henry VII of England and began the Tudor era. Henry had already agreed to marry Elizabeth of York so as to strengthen his position. Life massively improved for Elizabeth Woodville, as her marriage was now considered valid, which meant her rank improved highly, being a former queen and mother to the queen. Things started well. She became godmother to the couple's first child, but possibly there were tensions between Elizabeth and Margaret Beaufort. Rank was very important, and after everything Margaret had done to get her son on the throne, she would want no rival to her power and position. Around 1.5 years after Henry became king, Elizabeth went from court to living in an abbey. This may have been her choice, as it said she had possibly been planning it anyway, but she may have been pressured or even forced by Henry and his mother. It is thought there was a lack of trust between the king and Elizabeth, and he may have suspected her of plotting against him, which seems hard to believe in some ways, as she would never want to do anything to risk her daughter's position. At the abbey, Elizabeth was treated well, and she was visited by her daughters. In 1492, Elizabeth died when she was in her mid-50s. She was buried with her husband at Windsor Castle. Elizabeth is such an iconic person from this period of history, such a fun and determined woman who will always be loved by history fans.